The night bled into the horizon like a wound that refused to close. A slow-moving dusk settling over the forests southwest of Berlin, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Cold wind slithered between the pines, whispering through their blackened silhouettes, carrying with it the faint smell of damp soil and the metallic trace of distant rain. It was the same forest where, in late April of 1945, scattered Soviet detachments had once crawled forward under artillery flashes, pushed by a commander whose name would soon dissolve into the unnatural silence of disappearance. 80 years later, in the summer of 2025, two hikers stepped over a half-buried route and into the shadow of an abandoned military trench, unaware that beneath their boots slept the fractured remains of a mystery frozen in time. They bent down to examine an object wedged between stones and tangled roots. A Soviet medal, its surface darkened by soil and rust, its center torn by a clean, impossibly precise split, as though a rifle bullet had passed through it with surgical indifference. They lifted it in awe, thinking it nothing more than a relic. They did not yet know it had belonged to Commander Ilarion Mikhailovich Sidorov, a man whose final hours had never been recorded, whose name had been swallowed whole by the chaos closing around Berlin in the war's dying breath. The discovery would ignite a new wave of speculation, for Sidorov's disappearance had lived in the footnotes of military archives like a stubborn ghost. There had never been a body, never a confirmed sighting, never even a reliable witness capable of piecing together his last movements. What remained was a scattering of fragmented reports, a few contradictory testimonies, and a cluster of rumors whispered among veterans who insisted that Sidorov had been seen heading into the forest alone shortly before dawn on April 27, 1945. Some claimed he'd been hunting deserters. Others said he'd been summoned to a clandestine meeting by higher command. A few believed he had fled, abandoning his responsibility in the war's chaotic final moments. But among the oldest stories, told only in hushed tones, was the suggestion that Sidorov had been pursuing something else entirely. Something that tugged at him from the darkness between the trees, something that remained nameless in every archive, but etched itself into the anxious stares of men who refused to speak of what they'd heard that night. The hikers in 2025, unaware of this buried history, simply turned the medal over in their hands, brushing dirt from the worn Cyrillic lettering. The metal felt colder than it should have for a summer morning, unnaturally cold, as if still holding the chill of the night. Sidorov vanished. One of them hesitated, looking deeper into the trench, struck by a sudden sense that they were not standing alone. The forest seemed to lean closer, its branches creaking softly, its shadows stirring with the faint echo of footsteps from another era. It was then, somewhere between curiosity and unease, that the hikers pulled out their phones, snapping photographs that would later spread across forums, attracting amateur historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Some viewers recognized the medal instantly, the Order of the Red Star, typically awarded for exceptional service in combat, but none had ever seen one split so cleanly, as though intention rather than impact had shaped its destruction. The announcement of the find made its way to regional authorities within hours, and soon the quiet forest became a place of cautious activity. Uniformed personnel erected barriers, archaeologists dug carefully into the soil, and local news reporters murmured into microphones about a potentially significant wartime discovery. Yet even as the site filled with bright lights and methodical movement, the forest maintained an uncanny, lingering stillness. Whenever the wind died, those working in the trench swore they could hear faint metal tapping from somewhere deeper beneath their feet, though no tools struck anything in those moments. It was as if the earth itself remembered something and was trying to speak through the roots and stones. To fully understand why the split metal sent ripples through the community of historians, one had to look back to the last documented traces of Commander Sidorov's presence. He had been a respected officer, known for his precision, his discipline, and a sternness that bordered on severity. His battalion had pushed relentlessly toward Berlin in the final weeks of the war, losing men by the dozens as they traversed minefields, open roads torn by bombs and forests riddled with German resistance. Yet according to his soldiers, Sidorov had seemed increasingly distracted during those final days, often staring into the distance as though listening to something only he could hear. One diary entry, written by a junior officer, would later describe him as carrying the weight of something heavier than war, a phrase that researchers would debate for decades. What troubled historians most was the abruptness of his disappearance. The last confirmed sighting placed him near the forest's eastern edge, speaking quietly with two fellow officers. Witnesses remembered the tension of that moment, Sidorov clutching a map, arguing in a low, urgent voice, the other two men insisting he turn back, the forest behind them silent and unwelcoming. But then a sudden burst of distant gunfire had pulled attention elsewhere, and when the officers turned back, Sidorov was gone, leaving behind only his gloves and the faint outline of boot prints leading into the trees. A search was mounted, but the forest yielded nothing. No body, no weapon, no sign of struggle, only the sense that the trees had closed around him, swallowing him whole. The bullet-split metal recovered in 2025 was the first physical trace of him in 80 years, and yet instead of offering clarity, it only deepened the confusion. If the metal had been struck by a bullet, why was there no body nearby? Why had it been so precisely split, not shattered or dented, as most battlefield impacts would produce? Why had it been found buried nearly a meter beneath layers of roots and soil, as though deliberately placed there or swallowed slowly over decades by an earth that did not want to give it up? As dusk fell on the first day of excavation, one archaeologist noted that the forest seemed strangely louder than before, filled with sporadic cracking noises that echoed like distant footsteps. Another member of the team reported hearing a faint metallic ringing, like a metal clinking against a chest, though no one around them carried anything that could have made the sound. These remarks were dismissed as fatigue or imagination, but they spread quietly through the workers until each person found themselves glancing nervously toward the trees. It was during this quiet unease that a low mist began to gather in the trench, settling over the tools and equipment like a ghost emerging slowly from the soil. Deep within the mist, as the workers' voices fell to whispers, a single question seemed to drift through the air, unspoken but heavy, as if the forest itself demanded an answer. And as you immerse yourself in this story, following the eerie trail left behind by a vanished commander and a relic torn by impossible force, take a moment to write in the comments where you are watching from. Tell us from which corner of the world this echo of history has reached you, and whether the forest's voice feels as near to you as it does to those who stand beside the trench. The first day of analysis ended with more questions than answers, yet the sense of something unresolved lingered in the hearts of all who stood under the towering trees. As the sky darkened, a lone investigator remained behind, compelled by a strange intuition that the site held more than just artifacts. He knelt in the center of the trench, brushing aside a cluster of leaves, revealing faint scratches carved into the stone beneath. They formed no language he recognized, only crooked lines crossing over each other like the scars of an old wound. He traced them slowly with his fingers, feeling the coldness seep into his skin, and in that moment the forest exhaled, leaves rustling in unison, as if stirred by a presence awakened from long sleep. He stood abruptly, heart beating hard against his ribs, and retreated from the trench as night claimed the forest. Yet even as he walked back toward the lights of the research camp, he sensed he was being watched, not by animals, not by people, but by something older, something that had witnessed the last steps of Commander Sidorov and refused to release the memory. A shadow trembled between the trees, then vanished before the investigator could turn fully toward it. The narrative of Sidorov's disappearance was no longer confined to dusty archives. It had emerged again, breathing through soil and stone, gripping the imagination of all who approached it. And like the forest itself, the story seemed hungry, drawing in those who dared to question what had happened in those final hours near Berlin. Before we press deeper into this unsettling path, if the atmosphere of this mystery grips you, allow yourself to fall further into its shadows by subscribing to the channel. There are stories buried in the earth, waiting for light, and together we will uncover them one by one. The following morning, the forest was no longer quiet. Trucks rolled along the dirt paths, to their tires grinding over roots and wet earth. Reporters crowded near the newly cordoned perimeter, cameras trembling slightly in the wind as they captured the early light filtering through the mist. Inside the excavation zone, archaeologists worked with gloved hands, brushes, and small trowels, tracing careful arcs through the soil that had hidden the past for 80 years. Each movement felt delicate, ritualistic, as though any wrong gesture might disturb something that was not entirely at rest. The air was heavy with expectation. The split metal, now sealed within a glass container, rested on a temporary table nearby. Its fractured edge glinted faintly in the weak sunlight, resembling a wound frozen in metal. The inscription beneath the red star was barely legible, yet one line stood out clearly: "To Commander I.M. Sidorov." The confirmation came within hours. What they had found was indeed his. The announcement spread through local and international media like wildfire. Major news outlets broadcasted the story under dramatic headlines. "Lost Soviet hero unearthed in Berlin forest. The vanished commander returns. A mystery of the bullet-split medal." Historians were interviewed, each offering their interpretation. Some viewed the find as an invaluable piece of history, proof of a forgotten officer's final moments in the chaos of Berlin's fall. Others cautioned against sensationalism, reminding the public that the medal alone proved nothing. Still, the more they spoke, the more the story grew beyond their control. Online forums began to overflow with speculation. Some users posted supposed photographs of ghostly figures in the background of the excavation site. Others linked the discovery to Cold War conspiracies, suggesting that Sidorov had not died in 1945, but been taken by Soviet intelligence and erased from history for reasons unknown. But among the noise, one theory gained quiet traction: that Sidorov's disappearance had been deliberate, not the result of betrayal, but of pursuit. According to several letters uncovered in the Russian State Military Archive, Sidorov had written cryptic notes to his superiors in early April, describing voices in the forest and unmarked coordinates that had appeared on captured German maps. He had requested authorization to investigate, but the approval never came. The handwriting, however, was unmistakably his. For decades, these letters were dismissed as wartime stress, hallucinations brought on by exhaustion. But now, with the metal's discovery in the very area he had referenced, the letters took on a new, unsettling weight. One of the archaeologists, a woman named Dr. Elena Vorobyova, found herself increasingly drawn to the psychological dimension of the case. Late one evening, as the rest of the team retired to their tents, she remained by the trench, reviewing photographs under the dim beam of a headlamp. She noticed something odd about the soil surrounding the metal's resting place. Faint impressions of circular objects, as if several coins or discs had once lain beside it. Yet there had been only one artifact recovered. The others, if they existed, were gone. When she mentioned this to the team the next day, they dismissed it as compression marks from rocks. Still, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the ground had hidden something more deliberate. Perhaps a burial, perhaps a message left intentionally beneath the surface. As the investigation deepened, more peculiarities surfaced. The metal detector readings fluctuated erratically near the trench, as if the equipment itself resisted scanning certain areas. When workers dug where the readings spiked, they found only twisted roots and black stones. Yet those who touched the stones described a faint warmth, inconsistent with their surroundings. One technician joked that they were breathing stones. Nobody laughed. It was during one such excavation that a second discovery emerged. A fragment of leather, almost entirely decomposed, with faint Cyrillic writing on it. Part of a soldier's field notebook. The ink was washed away by time, but 2 words remained legible. Don't follow. From that moment onward, the site seemed to shift in atmosphere. The laughter that once filled the mornings grew scarce. Conversations grew quieter. Even the journalists who had once crowded the edge of the forest began to leave, uneasy with the pervasive sense of watchfulness that hung in the air. The few who stayed noticed strange technical failures. Microphones cutting out mid-sentence, cameras showing bursts of static when pointed toward the trench. It was as if something there rejected observation. Dr. Vorobyova began to experience recurring dreams. In them she walked through the forest at night, hearing faint rhythmic sounds, not voices, but something between speech and machinery, a cadence that echoed from the ground itself. Always, she saw a shadow ahead of her, moving between the trees, a tall figure in a Soviet greatcoat, shoulders rigid, head turned slightly as if listening. When she called out, the figure would stop, turn halfway toward her, and vanish, leaving behind only a glimmer of metal in the air where its chest should have been. She began to wake at 3:17 every night, trembling, her skin damp with cold sweat. The number etched itself into her mind until she could no longer tell if she'd seen it before. In the documents, on the coordinates, or only in her dreams. It was on the 3rd week of excavation that the team uncovered something that defied explanation. Roughly 2 meters below the surface, beneath a layer of compacted soil, they found what appeared to be the remnants of a bunker wall, but it was not listed in any wartime maps, Soviet or German. Embedded in the concrete was a rusted door, its hinges fused by time, its center marked by an impact pattern eerily similar to the split in Sidorov's metal. They cleared the surrounding soil carefully, and when the door was fully exposed, silence consumed the site. No one spoke for several minutes. Then the site commander ordered the trench widened. The operation to open the door began the next morning. Sparks flew as saws screamed against the corroded metal. Every few minutes the sound would falter, as if the machinery itself hesitated. Finally, with a grinding groan, the seal broke, A wave of air rushed out, stale, cold, and faintly metallic, smelling of earth and decay. A flashlight beam pierced the darkness inside, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The walls were damp, streaked with black residue. No one volunteered to enter first. Eventually, a small team descended, their boots echoing faintly as they moved into the void below. What they found would never appear in official reports. The room at the bottom was small, barely large enough to hold 6 people. The floor was littered with rusted tools, fragments of uniforms, and a single overturned chair. On the far wall hung a Soviet banner, its red long faded to brown, its center marked by a dark stain that might once have been blood. In the middle of the room lay a metal case, split open by force. Inside were papers so degraded that only a few fragments remained intact. But among them, one page carried a legible sentence written in trembling ink. He heard it too late. No signature, no date, only that sentence. The silence that followed was suffocating. The team retrieved the documents and ascended, closing the door behind them, sealing the air once more. But something came with them, not tangible, but perceptible in every trembling breath. That night, several members of the crew refused to sleep near the trench, claiming they heard boots walking over the earth above them, though the perimeter was guarded. One soldier swore he saw a shape standing at the edge of the trees, wearing an officer's coat that fluttered though there was no wind. The following morning, the commander ordered all personnel withdrawn from the site, pending official investigation. Yet by then, the forest had already claimed another victim, a technician who vanished during the early hours, leaving only his flashlight and a trail of footprints that led into the same direction Sidorov's had once taken. By the time the sun rose, the mist was thicker than ever, the forest shrouded in a pale glow that erased all distinction between past and present. The cameras that had been left running overnight captured nothing, no figures, no movement, only static and the faint rhythmic clicking of something metallic echoing from deep within the earth. And so, the forest of Brandenburg became once again a place of absence, a mirror to the disappearance it had hidden for nearly a century. The metal, fractured and defiant, remained the only witness. If you find yourself drawn into the shadows of this mystery, if you want to follow the voice that still whispers between the trees and the echoes of men who vanished long ago, stay with us. Subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happened beneath that forest was only the beginning. When the Brandenburg Forest was finally cleared of personnel and sealed under temporary military supervision, the story should have ended there. But silence, especially one that thick, never lasts long. Within days, fragments of footage recorded by the excavation team began to leak online. Short, unstable clips captured by handheld cameras, their timestamps flickering with corrupted digits. One clip showed the interior of the bunker for only 3 seconds, a beam of light sweeping across the decaying wall, catching for a moment the faded Soviet banner, and then freezing abruptly as the image distorted into a haze of static. The sound that accompanied it was worse than the image itself. Low, rhythmic, mechanical, like a pulse trapped in iron. Some who listened claimed to hear a human breath buried beneath it, a single exhalation breaking through the interference before the feed cut to black. The authorities dismissed the videos as doctored fabrications, but no one could explain why the metadata traced back to the original excavation equipment. The official narrative tightened like a noose, and yet the public's fascination only deepened. Weeks later, a journalist named Henrik Adler arrived in the nearby village of Treuenbrietzen, determined to uncover what had really been found in the woods. He was the kind of man who lived on obsession, gray-eyed, hollow from sleeplessness, his coat perpetually damp from the German rain. He rented a room above the local tavern, carrying nothing but a recorder, a camera, and a worn copy of wartime Soviet correspondence. By day, he walked the dirt roads that cut through the forest's edge, talking to hunters, farmers, and old residents who still remembered the thunder of artillery from 1945. By night, he wrote feverishly, his notes filling with contradictions. Villagers spoke of Soviet patrols disappearing near the riverbanks, of flickering lights between the trees in the years following the war, of old men who claimed to have seen an officer wandering the forest long after 1945, silent and pale, his uniform frozen in another century. The most striking testimony came from a man named Otto Hahn, a retired ranger who had served as a forest warden for 50 years. His voice trembled as he described the discovery he had made back in 1968, long before the hikers of 2025. A rusted Soviet helmet, half buried near a cluster of stones, and beside it, a small, sealed, metal canister. Inside, according to Ott, was a strip of brittle film, coiled tightly around itself, with frames too dark and damaged to recognize. It wasn't normal footage, Otto had said, lowering his eyes. It looked like it was shot underground. There were lights, swinging, circular, and faces, but the faces weren't moving right, like they were caught between frames. He handed the canister to local authorities at the time, but it vanished within weeks. No record of it remained in any archive. Henrik's investigation brought him deeper into the forest with each passing day. He retraced the coordinates published in early reports and found the perimeter fence still standing, draped in fog. Inside, the earth was uneven, marked by shallow depressions where the trench had once been. He recorded everything, his voice low and deliberate as he described the smell of the soil, moist, metallic, faintly acidic. He paused often, listening to the faint tremor of wind. Yet sometimes, in playback, the recordings would distort. Faint words could be heard under his voice, whispers that did not belong to him. "Go back," one seemed to murmur. Another, clearer, said something in Russian, barely audible. "On ne spit, he does not sleep." One evening, after a long day of wandering through the overgrown paths, Henrik stumbled upon what looked like a shallow pit filled with water, reflecting the pale light of the moon. He leaned closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The reflection did not match the movement of the water. He saw himself, yes, but beside him, a second figure stood, its features obscured by shadow, its eyes glinting like steel. When he turned, there was nothing, only the forest breathing, only the faint creak of distant trees. That night, in his room above the tavern, Henrik played back his footage, frame by frame. The reflection was there again, clearer now, a tall figure in a Soviet officer's uniform, a medal glinting on his chest, its center marked by a small, perfect hole. When Henrik slowed the frame to a crawl, he saw something even stranger. The metal seemed to pulse faintly, as though light were moving through it from within. The next morning, he sent the footage to his editor in Berlin, but the files corrupted during transfer, replaced by blank audio and a single repeated line of static noise that sounded almost like a man's voice whispering the same words again and again. "Don't follow." By the second week of Henrik's stay, villagers noticed changes in him. His eyes grew red. His speech slowed. He stopped eating. He would sit for hours outside the tavern, staring at the forest's edge, muttering softly in Russian phrases that no one understood. He spoke of coordinates, of tunnels beneath the soil, of a command that had been given but never rescinded. He claimed that Sidorov had not died, but had found something beneath the ground, something that was not meant to be seen, something that waited. The metal wasn't broken by a bullet, Henrik told Otto one night. It was split from the inside, as if the metal tried to escape itself. 2 nights later, the villagers awoke to the distant hum of engines. A convoy of unmarked vehicles entered the forest, their lights muted, their movement silent. By dawn, the area was sealed once again. Henrik was gone. His room upstairs remained untouched, except for a single object left on the desk, a Soviet notebook, pages warped by moisture, its last entry written in a shaky hand. I saw him. He wears his shadow like a second coat. No signature, no trace of where he had gone. Only the echo of boots in the hall that night, recorded faintly on the tavern's security camera, boots walking in rhythm, stopping, turning toward the door, and then silence. When the footage reached online communities, the legend of the vanished commander grew into something darker. Some claimed the forest was cursed, that it fed on those who sought its secrets. Others insisted it was a military cover-up, hiding an experiment from the war's final days, an attempt to manipulate sound, perception, or time itself. But the most persistent theory came from those who noticed a pattern, the frequency embedded in the leaked recordings, a steady pulse that repeated every 17 seconds, the same number that haunted Dr. Vorobyova's dreams. Experts analyzed it, describing it as too structured to be random, too organic to be mechanical. One scientist noted that if converted to a spectrogram, the frequency formed shapes resembling Cyrillic letters. When deciphered, they spelled a single name: Sidorov. The story, by then, had escaped control. Reporters vanished into speculation. Podcasts dissected every noise, every shadow in the available footage, and online viewers began to visit the forest themselves, drawn by morbid curiosity. They carried drones, cameras, devices. None of them lasted long. Batteries drained without warning, compasses spun, and several claimed to hear the same metallic tapping deep beneath their feet, as if something below the surface was moving. The government quickly declared the site restricted, citing soil instability and unexploded ordnance. But the statement convinced no one. What was buried there was no longer just history. It was something alive in rumor, pulsing through the dark corners of the internet like an infection. That winter, snowfall blanketed Brandenburg, sealing the forest in quiet. Yet the silence was deceptive. Every few weeks, hikers reported seeing faint red glows between the trees, flickering and fading, like the reflection of a distant fire. Locals learned not to look too closely. The tavern closed, its windows boarded, its door chained. Otto Hahn passed away quietly that spring, leaving behind a note scrawled on the back of a forestry map. Heard the steps again. Closer this time. The metal itself was transferred to a government facility for study. Officially, it was described as a historical artifact of limited significance. Unofficially, technicians tasked with its analysis refused to work near it for more than an hour at a time. They claimed the temperature in the examination room dropped each time the case was opened, that the metal emitted a faint vibration at irregular intervals, one that could be felt in the chest more than heard. One worker quit after claiming that while cataloging the artifact, he heard a whisper in Russian right beside his ear, a voice that said, "The order remains." The forest remained silent again, for a while. until one night in early spring, the sensors at the excavation site registered a new movement, subtle but distinct. Pressure changes, soil displacement, something shifting below, right where the bunker had been sealed. Cameras sent to capture the disturbance failed within seconds. The last frame they transmitted showed the trench from above, the snow melting in a perfect circle, the soil beneath it trembling like breath. So many decades later, the earth still held the echo of a man who walked into the trees and never returned, whose metal defied time, whose shadow outlived him. Commander Ilarion Mikhailovich Sidorov had vanished, yes, but the forest, it seemed, had never let him go. If you've stayed with the story this far, drawn into the silence and the whispers beneath the soil, make sure you stay with us for what follows. Subscribe and step deeper into the darkness, because somewhere, beneath layers of time and ash, the commander still walks. By the time spring's thaw reached Brandenburg, the forest had begun to change. Not visibly at first. Its trees still stood like black spears against the dull sky, the soil still heavy with frost, but there was something beneath it, something breathing differently. Satellite imagery revealed faint depressions forming near the old excavation site, circular and too symmetrical to be natural. The authorities dismissed them as soil subsidence, but those who had worked the site before recognized the pattern, the same perimeter once mapped by Commander Sidorov's final movements in 1945. It was as though the forest itself remembered the paths his boots had carved through its mud and was slowly resurrecting them. Meanwhile, in a private laboratory on the outskirts of Potsdam, the split metal rested inside a sealed containment unit. 3 cameras monitored it 24 hours a day. The researchers assigned to its analysis were instructed not to touch the object directly and to record any fluctuations in its temperature or magnetic field. At first, their reports were clinical, minor readings, nothing extraordinary. But then the data began to change. The metal's temperature dropped 3 degrees below ambient, and its magnetic field pulsed intermittently, as if responding to an unseen rhythm. When analyzed, those pulses formed a sequence that repeated every 3 minutes and 17 seconds, always that number. The researchers cross-referenced it against wartime frequencies, Morse codes, even cardiac rhythms. None matched. On the 7th day of observation, the glass chamber fogged from the inside, though the environment was dry and sealed. A faint pattern appeared on the condensation, a circle bisected by a vertical line. When wiped clean, the surface cooled instantly, the fog returning within seconds. One of the researchers, a young technician named Victor, swore he heard something behind the hum of the equipment, a distant metallic clang, like boots striking concrete. He turned to his colleague and asked if she heard it too. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the chamber. The metal, she said, had just moved. They replayed the footage, frame by frame, second by second. The metal remained still, but the shadow beneath it shifted slightly to the left against the direction of the light source. Victor laughed nervously, muttering something about optical illusions. Yet when he reviewed the footage again the next morning, the shadow had returned to its original position. Only now, faint scratches appeared on the inner surface of the glass. 4 marks. Straight. Parallel. Like the fingers of a hand pressing outward. When the senior supervisor arrived, he ordered the footage destroyed and replaced with a fabricated report citing equipment error. But secrets, like echoes, do not die when silenced. They spread. Within a week, a new file appeared on an encrypted forum used by independent researchers of historical anomalies. It contained 3 still images, one of the metal under low light, one of the fogged glass, and one of the scratches. The file name was simple. "I still there, JPG." That was when the pattern began to repeat. Across Europe, small reports surfaced of individuals hearing rhythmic metallic noises in the night, always described the same way. 3 slow taps, a pause, then one sharp strike. The sound, they said, came from beneath floors, from walls, from the metal frames of old buildings. It was faint, but deliberate, too controlled to be random. In some cases, electrical devices would flicker in sync with the tapping. In one chilling account from Poland, a museum guard claimed that an old Soviet display medal on exhibit vibrated so violently it cracked its case open, revealing an identical split across its center. Meanwhile, Dr. Elena Vorobyova, who had returned to Moscow after the excavation, found herself unable to let go of the mystery. She had taken leave from her university and rented a small apartment near the city's edge, where she spent long nights analyzing data and rereading Sidorov's archived correspondence. What haunted her most was not the physical evidence, but the language, the way his final letters shifted from military brevity to something bordering on desperation. His last known dispatch, sent 2 days before his disappearance, read, "The coordinates are moving. The sound is closer." They said it was an echo, but echoes don't follow orders. Late one night, while reviewing an old microfilm copy of his field notes, Elena noticed faint imprints beneath the visible ink, indentations left by another pen on the page above. She enhanced the image digitally until the markings became legible. What emerged were lines written in haste. "I am not alone down here." Beneath it, a second line, more hesitant, more broken. "It wears my voice now." The discovery left her sleepless for days. She began recording her thoughts in an audio journal, documenting every lead, every unsettling coincidence. On the 3rd night of these recordings, something happened. Midway through playback, her voice was interrupted by another, layered beneath it, identical in tone, but delayed by less than a second, repeating each of her sentences as if mocking them. She deleted the file immediately, but the next recording began the same way. She stopped using her recorder after that, compelled by the need to understand what had happened to Sidorov. Elena contacted one of her old colleagues in Berlin, an expert in wartime communication. He agreed to meet her and analyze the frequency patterns recovered from the metal. When he fed the data through his sound modulation software, the output formed a repeating series of tones that, when slowed down, resembled speech. Russian speech. The words were fragmented, distorted, but 2 were unmistakable: wait and below. That night, Elena wrote a final entry in her private notes. "He's not gone. He's waiting under us." Then she vanished. The apartment was found unlocked, lights still on, laptop open to a blank document. The audio recorder, though smashed, contained one recoverable clip. The first 20 seconds were silent except for faint static. Then, just before the file ended, a man's voice whispered a single word in Russian: "Return." Back in Brandenburg, the forest began to show signs of life again, or something that resembled it. In the thawing soil, excavation markers reappeared where none should have been. Locals heard trucks in the night, lights moving between trees, though no convoy was reported. One shepherd claimed that when he led his flock near the forest's edge, the animals refused to cross a certain line in the dirt, pressing close together as if sensing an invisible boundary. A week later, his dog disappeared. He found the collar days afterward, neatly laid atop a stone, beside a single military button. Theories spiraled out of control. Some insisted that Sidorov had discovered a hidden bunker network built by retreating German scientists, an attempt at some weapon or experiment that distorted perception itself. Others whispered of a Soviet operation buried deep in classified archives, one that sought to communicate with the dead using sound frequencies and resonance fields. The truth, however, remained buried in layers of conflicting testimony and silence. What no one yet realized was that Sidorov's story was still unfolding, not as history, but as contagion. The metal was no longer just a relic. It was a conduit, transmitting something that moved not through air or space, but through the minds of those who listened too closely. And the forest, patient as ever, waited. Some nights, satellite microphones picked up faint pulses emanating from the Brandenburg area. 3 soft impacts, followed by 1 sharp strike, repeating every 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Always the same rhythm, always the same silence after. If you're still here, following this descent into the unseen, pause for a moment. Like this story, history has places that don't want to be remembered. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way in the dark when we step into what comes next. The echoes are only growing louder. By the summer of 2025, the Brandenburg Forest had become a forbidden place. Officially, it was designated as an environmental hazard due to soil instability. In practice, it had turned into something else entirely, a zone of silence, patrolled occasionally by men in unmarked vehicles, where even the wind seemed reluctant to move. Local maps began omitting it. GPS signals failed within a mile of its borders, replaced by loops of static that, when recorded and analyzed, carried faint rhythmic tones beneath the noise. 3 soft pulses, 1 sharp. The same pattern, always the same. Yet despite the restrictions, people kept coming. Journalists, thrill seekers, and self-proclaimed investigators ventured into the perimeter with cameras and drones, each searching for proof of what had truly been found beneath the forest floor. Few stayed long. Some returned with corrupted footage, their devices inexplicably wiped clean except for distorted fragments of audio, breathing, footsteps, metallic scratching. Others never returned at all. Their last transmissions were nothing but silence, broken by faint clicks. Those who studied the recovered audio noted that the clicks, when converted to Morse, spelled order. Among those drawn to the mystery was a young historian named Elias Kruger. He had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories of the war, the chaos of 1945, the Soviet advance, the bodies that disappeared into the woods and were never seen again. Elias was not a man of superstition. He approached the tale of Commander Sidorov with the mind of a researcher, not a believer. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in data. Yet as he read through the fragments leaked online, the letters, the photographs, the whispers, something began to shift inside him. Logic, he discovered, had its own limits when confronted with the weight of silence. He arrived in Treuenbrietzen in August, renting the same room once occupied by Henrik Adler, the vanished journalist. The tavern had reopened under new ownership, though its walls still carried the same uneasy stillness. The air inside was heavy, soaked with the residue of whispered stories. Elias spent his days combing through archives and public records, his nights walking the forest edge with a small recorder, speaking into the dark like a confessor. If you're still out there, Commander, he would say softly. "Tell me what you saw." For weeks, nothing answered. The nights remained still, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of foxes. Then one evening his recorder caught something, faint but distinct, a metallic tap, then another, 3 slow beats, followed by a pause, then one sharp strike. He froze, staring into the blackness between the trees. The air grew colder, denser, the silence pressing against his skin like water. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by a sense that the sound was not coming from above or below, but from everywhere at once. When he played back the audio later in his room, he noticed a second sound layered beneath the taps, a low murmuring voice speaking in Russian. He sent the clip to a linguist friend in Berlin, who confirmed the translation. "He's listening." That was the night Elias stopped treating the story as history. Over the following days, he found himself drawn to the same paths that Sidorov had taken in 1945, guided by declassified maps and the coordinates found in the commander's letters. The forest resisted him at every turn. Compasses spun erratically, paths folded in on themselves, and even his footprints seemed to fade quicker than they should. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of rust and rain. At times, he swore he could hear distant marching, boots moving in perfect rhythm, but whenever he stopped to listen, the sound ceased. On the 7th day, he discovered something strange. A series of stones arranged in a perfect circle near the old trench site. In the center lay a depression in the earth, as though something had once been buried there and later removed. The soil within the circle was unnaturally cold, and beneath it, Elias found fragments of corroded metal, buttons, buckles, and a shard of something unmistakable, Soviet insignia. But one fragment stood apart. It was smooth, polished, and faintly reflective, like glass, but heavier. When he lifted it, the air around him vibrated with a deep, low hum that resonated through his bones. He dropped it instantly, and the hum stopped. He marked the location and returned to town, determined to report his finding. But when he played back his field recordings that night, every file was corrupted, except one. It lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. In it, his voice could be heard describing the stones, the soil, the shard. Then silence. And finally, at the very end, a second voice. Male, deep, calm, whispered in Russian, "You shouldn't have moved it." The following morning, Elias's hotel room was empty. His car remained parked outside, his belongings untouched, his wallet and keys still on the table. Only the recorder was missing. Days later, a hiker found it near the forest entrance, lying beside a footprint that led into the trees and stopped abruptly after 5 steps. The final recording on the device was identical to the others. 3 soft taps, 1 sharp, then silence. After Elias's disappearance, local authorities finally sealed the area permanently. But within weeks, nearby residents began reporting strange phenomena. Phones vibrating with no calls, power surges synchronized to invisible rhythms, and at night, voices that seemed to echo from their radios, even when unplugged. One phrase repeated over and over, in Russian and in English, "Return the medal." In Moscow, the laboratory that had housed the artifact went dark without explanation. The official report cited a fire, but those who lived nearby spoke of a low, thunderous sound before the power grid failed, a resonance that rattled windows and sent birds scattering from the trees. When emergency teams arrived, the facility was empty. The containment chamber was shattered from the inside, Its glass curled outward like petals of steel. The metal was gone. What followed were weeks of confusion and silence. The forest, as though satiated for a moment, fell quiet. News coverage faded. Files disappeared. The official narrative shifted toward disinterest. But deep within the archives of a forgotten department, a final note was added to the case file of Commander Ilarion Mikhailovich Sidorov. It read simply, "Status active. Observation continues." No one knows who wrote it, and yet travelers who pass near the Brandenburg Forest on fog-heavy nights sometimes report seeing a solitary figure between the trees. A man in a long Soviet greatcoat, a gleam of broken metal at his chest, his posture rigid, his face turned slightly toward the road as if listening. He never moves, never speaks, but those who drive past claim their radios fill with faint static, followed by the same 4-beat rhythm, 3 soft, 1 sharp. Some say it's interference, others say it's a signal, but those who know the story whisper something different, that the commander never left his post, that his last order still echoes through the soil, that what he found beneath Berlin's dying sky was not victory or death, but something far older, patient, and waiting. If you've followed the story this far, if you can still hear the faint tapping between silences, remember to stay close. Like the signal, this story continues, deeper, darker, and closer than you think. Subscribe, so you don't lose the trail when we step into the final descent. The commander has not finished his march. The year had turned again, and with it, the forest of Brandenburg retreated into winter silence. The air hung heavy with snow, muting every sound except the occasional groan of old trees bending under the weight of ice. The perimeter fence still stood, half buried beneath frost, its warning signs faded and unreadable. From a distance it looked peaceful, a scar disguised as serenity. But those who lived nearby knew better. They had learned to avoid the place when the sky turned pale and sound carried strangely. Some said you could hear marching in the cold, the rhythmic cadence of boots crunching snow where no footprints appeared. Others claimed that on certain nights you could see the faint shimmer of metal flickering between the trees, like breath catching light. In early 2026, a new investigation quietly emerged under the guise of a historical commission. It was led by a man named Lev Gromov, a former military historian from St. Petersburg, with connections to archives that no longer officially existed. His mission, at least on paper, was to recover remaining Soviet remains from the war and repatriate them. But Gromov's interest in the Brandenburg case ran deeper. He had read the sealed documents, seen the still frames of the metal chamber, listened to the last audio from Elias Kruger's recorder. He had traced every signal, every fragment of data, until a pattern emerged, coordinates shifting in time, not space, like something trying to reassert itself through repetition. The last set of coordinates pointed directly to the forest. He assembled a small team of specialists in acoustic resonance and electromagnetic anomalies, and set out for Germany, determined to end what had begun 80 years ago. They arrived in late January. The cold bit through their gloves as they approached the fence. Their breath fogged in the still air, and beneath the snow, the ground felt hollow, as though a vast cavity lay just beneath their feet. The forest seemed to watch them. Every step forward was an intrusion, every sound swallowed too quickly. Gromov carried with him the copy of Sidorov's final dispatch, the one historians had long dismissed as madness. He read it aloud quietly as they entered, his voice trembling but firm. "The sound is closer. If I do not return, follow the echo, not the path." The team set up equipment near the original trench site, sensors, recorders, magnetic resonance meters. As the machines hummed to life, the readings began to climb immediately. Subtle vibrations passed through the ground in regular intervals. 3 slow tremors, 1 sharp. Gromov leaned closer to the monitor, watching the frequency spike. "It's not interference," one of his technicians whispered. "It's signaling." The tremors grew stronger, synchronizing with the pulse of the sensors themselves, as though the forest were breathing in unison with the machines. Snow began to fall harder, dense and silent. Somewhere deep below, metal groaned like an awakening door. Then came the sound, faint at first, then rising, a deep, resonant hum, neither mechanical nor natural, that rolled through the trees like distant thunder. The team froze. The hum shifted into rhythm. 3 tones, 1 strike, the same pattern. The air vibrated with it, heavy enough to shake loose frost from the branches. One technician stepped back, eyes wide. "It's responding to us," he said. Gromov raised a hand, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "No," he murmured. "We're responding to it." The ground split open without warning. A low rumble tore through the clearing as snow collapsed inward, revealing a hollow space beneath. A chamber, long buried, its entrance marked by the rusted outline of a door identical to the one found and resealed a year earlier. But this time, the door stood open, light, not bright but dim and gray, like the afterglow of an eclipse, poured upward from within. The hum stopped. Silence returned, thick and absolute. The team stared into the opening. Gromov descended first. The air inside was colder than ice, yet it carried the faint scent of oil and rust, as if something mechanical had long ago tried to breathe. The narrow stairwell led into a corridor lined with cracked concrete. On the walls were marks, scratches, numbers, fragments of Cyrillic words etched by trembling hands. Some read, "Hold," others, "Wait," and one phrase repeated again and again in uneven script. "On idiot. He is coming." At the corridor's end lay a small chamber. Inside stood a table covered in dust and debris. On it, a metal case identical to the one once found and lost decades ago. But this one was intact. Gromov brushed the frost away, opened the latch, and froze. Inside was a single medal, unbroken, gleaming faintly despite the lack of light. The Order of the Red Star, pristine. Beneath it lay a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, bearing handwriting that matched Sidorov's known signature. The letter was dated April 27th, 1945. It read, "To whoever finds this, we were wrong. It does not come from above. It listens from below. I can hear it in the metal, in the echo of our guns, in the silence between shots. We thought we were digging for victory. We dug for it instead. The ground is alive with its voice. If it speaks to you, do not answer. If you wear the star, remove it. The order is finished." Gromov's hands trembled. The metal inside the case began to vibrate, faintly at first, then violently, the hum rising once more through the walls. The team above shouted through the radio, their voices breaking with static. "The readings are off the scale," someone screamed. "It's resonating with the entire field." The lights flickered. The air thickened. Gromov stepped back, clutching the case to his chest, as the walls trembled. For a brief moment, through the blur of vibration and noise, he thought he saw movement. A figure standing in the doorway, tall, rigid, wearing the shadow of a uniform. The hum stopped. Darkness fell. Hours later, when the storm cleared, the forest was empty again. The equipment remained, half buried in snow, still recording. The footage recovered from those cameras would later show the clearing moments before the collapse. Faint light flickering from below, snow lifting in spirals, and a figure stepping out from the shadow of the trench. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his greatcoat torn and heavy with frost. On his chest, the red star glinted briefly before shattering cleanly down the middle. The figure looked toward the camera, eyes pale and distant, and then the frame cut to black. The Brandenburg site was never reopened, though the recordings were confiscated, the existence of Gromov's team erased from all registries. Yet in the months that followed, seismic sensors across Europe detected subtle, rhythmic tremors originating from beneath northern Germany. The same 4-beat pattern, 3 soft, 1 sharp. Geologists dismissed them as interference, but those who had heard the recordings before knew better. It was not the earth that was moving. It was something beneath it, something calling. In time, stories would spread again. Truck drivers passing through the region reported radios cutting out at the same mile marker. Hikers spoke of whispers in Russian carried on the wind. On cold nights, the lights of passing cars reflected off something deep among the trees, something metallic, shifting slowly as though waiting to be found. And so, the legend endures. The vanished Soviet commander whose final order never ended, whose presence remains woven into the soil of a foreign forest, his signals still echoing through the static of time. Some say he was cursed, others that he uncovered a secret buried too deep for human comprehension. But perhaps the truth is simpler and far darker, that the war never truly ended for him, that in the endless hum beneath the ground, in the trembling of the earth, in the faint rhythm that returns again and again, he still listens, still waits, still marches. If you have walked through this story and felt the cold weight of its silence, then you've heard the echo too. Let it remind you that not all disappearances fade with time. Some keep speaking, even through the soil. So before the next story begins, take a breath, hold your silence for a moment longer, and if the darkness has followed you this far, leave your mark below. Like the echo, like the signal, your presence keeps the story alive. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this with those who walk too close to forgotten places. Because somewhere beneath the snow and steel, the commander is still listening, and the ground beneath Berlin is never truly still.